Hello, my name is Father Timothy Tighe, and I want to welcome you to Overview 16 in our journey of faith in the light of the cross. Thank you so much for joining us. We look up on our screen and we see the theme for Overview 16. How do modern insights into Bible history help us better to see God's core teachings at Sinai around 1180 BC? And secondly, did God wondrously inspire JEPD editors over 8 centuries to complete the original core of Torah around 400 BC and do it faithfully? We go on to our next screen and we read, 3 distinct periods form Torah's core. Early stories of Passover from Egypt to Sinai around 1180 BC, to Judges in the Promised Land around 1050 BC. Secondly, J&E editors better organized these old stories into a history of creation and sin, then placed Moses and the Sinai covenant at the center of history during Kings and Prophets 950 to 586 BC when Judah was destroyed. Thirdly, priests and Deuteronomic editors used Israel's and Judah's destructive sins and humiliating exile to flesh out the history of salvation in Torah 586 to 400 BC. We go on to our next screen to continue. Scholarly insights have minimized the effects of colorful exaggerations on modern readers. So we no longer feel silly for taking seriously basic Bible teachings that deeply affect our lives, even if it has colorful exaggerations. With historical insights, we seek to see the historical core more simply, being able to see it as through an X-ray as the spine of Torah. That's our goal. We go on to our next screen and we read, it begins with Jacob working with other prosperous sheiks and Pharaoh to govern pastoral Canaan, which is later called Israel. Jacob sent Joseph, his son, to a pedagogue in Egypt to be educated with Pharaoh's sons and other prosperous firstborn sons to manage their families' inheritances. But 10 half-brothers hated Joseph's educated attitude and sold him back to Egypt. Get out of here. Joseph knew powerful people on his return to Egypt, so he won high positions in Egypt's bureaucracy. We go on to our next screen and we continue. Because of famine, Jacob sought help in Egypt. Wondrously, Joseph was there to help him. But Joseph learned to see that non-Egyptian servants were less threatening to the powerful, so often they liked to work them better if they were at a distance. So he told Jacob to stay separate, keep all the people separate and different, and not mix with Egyptians. They'd be safer. But we assume that Joseph had his 2 sons and other gifted nephews well educated for future survival. So Jacob's grandsons, like Joseph his son, became educated to work for the powers that be wherever they were and well into the future. We go on to our next screen and we continue reading. Egypt's language was written in hieroglyphics, so Semites, that's Israel, in Egypt who wrote an alphabet had to be bilingual or transliterate. So Egypt used Semites to write documents to leaders in Canaan, and modern scholars have discovered a lot of these documents sent from Egypt to Canaan in alphabet. In time, different became a proud status, for different evolved into meaning holy. Centuries later, Judeans loved being different, and that comes down to today. Over the next 400 years after Joseph, most of Jacob's tribes migrated back to Canaan to reclaim pastoral land, now changing to farmland. Then. We go on to our next screen and we continue reading. Somehow the Levites, including Moses' own family, became the tribe that preferred education and working in Pharaoh's household, his bureaucracy, to going back to claim pastoral land in Canaan, Israel. Thus, when they later arrived in Canaan, Levites focused using the Sinai covenant to centralize the tribes around one central city, holy place, Jerusalem. They didn't want to go out on a farm. Levite managerial work in Egypt included supervising crews of Semitic Habiru refugees who made bricks for construction projects. We go on to our next screen. 400 years later, Moses was born to a Levite family familiar with Pharaoh's household, and they knew everybody there. Moses' older brother Aaron, born before the ban on baby boys, was familiar with Pharaoh's household and knew the ways of Egypt's priests before Moses was born. So it was reasonable for Pharaoh's daughter to rescue Moses and let his mother nurse him. Scholars note that more Levites than other tribes had Egyptian names, including the name Moses. We go on to our next screen and we continue reading. As Pharaoh became very oppressive, young Moses grew so angry he killed an Egyptian god for abusing an Habiru worker under Levite supervision. Note well, Habiru workers did not identify with Moses, even though he was trying to help them. As an educated house servant, he was of an upper class. This story is important because Moses escaped as an exile into the Sinai desert wilderness. There he learned how shepherds survived, fed and watered their sheep. Thus, he was prepared to feed and water Israel and their sheep through a desert wilderness. We go on to our next screen and we read, familiar with Pharaoh's daughter and household, it seems reasonable for Moses to return a generation later and win a meeting with a new Pharaoh that might have been a classmate. Even more, the ban on killing baby boys was proclaimed because of an excess population of Habiru Hebrew men who might revolt. So it seems reasonable that Pharaoh could be persuaded to allow a Habiru tribe to migrate back to Canaan to relieve overpopulation in Egypt. We go on to our next screen and we read, note well, Habirus also had to leave Egypt to pray, for prayers to other gods were forbidden on Egyptian soil. We didn't know what god the Habiru had, but it wasn't Egyptian. Besides, Habiru was considered Pharaoh's image as a hateful god of slavery, and that's what they were supposed to pray to. So Habirus accepted Moses' teaching that Israel's God of the desert wilderness did not reveal his face or image. Thus the Sinai God with no image could grow into a universal God by Jesus all through the centuries. But cultural images and rules limit and stunt God's growth, so we have in the Roman Catholic faith no culture putting limits on God. We go on to our next screen and we continue reading. Moses believed that God did not appear in image, but commanded him in the desert to go free Hebrews from slavery, his voice and his words, but no image. Overview 15 said Habirus were refugees in alien countries. No law blessed them, for all cultural laws limited outsiders and aliens. But they were free to grow in God in the desert wilderness, and this is so important. Moses was educated to organize and manage people to work in orderly ways. So he had to make a covenant with God to guide the Habirus through the desert. We go on to our next screen. So Moses made a covenant with God that would bless and guide Habirus through the desert wilderness. An educated class of Levites, including Aaron, also needed the Sinai covenant as a guide to lead the Habirus through the wilderness. Now the first command, you shall have no images before me. Moses descended Sinai with a veiled face so there would be no confusion with God's face. He was not God. And he named Aaron high priest of his covenant, for Aaron knew the priestly ways in Egypt and could not be confused with God. We go on to our next screen and we continue reading. The command of no images and you shall not commit adultery strangely go together. For Moses knew only orderly, responsible people could journey through the wilderness to the land of Canaan. Moses hated, as he looked back from the desert, the disordered, pained fertility cults inflicted on families. It was simply adultery, and he knew it. It broke up families. But while Moses was on Sinai, Aaron lapsed into an Egyptian priest and allowed a fertility cult orgy to break out before a golden calf. The first atonement ceremony followed, which is very important in the history of the covenant. We go on to our next screen and we continue reading. Fertility sex was at the center of Israel's sins that caused its destruction. Marriage sex can be difficult, for it unites a couple in all of their cares and sorrows and responsibilities, as well as joys. Fertility cults used set-aside human beings, they called them prostitutes, as images of gods that lifted human beings up out of all their cares and responsibility through sex into a higher order of divine ecstasy. Lovely fantasies. Ecstasy means standing beyond, fantasizing divine approval, free from all cares and responsibilities, especially family and life-giving responsibilities. We go on to our next screen and we continue reading. Cults encouraged irresponsible addictions. Fantasy sex ends with feelings of emptiness and cravings for more ecstasy, that is, addictions. Moses called former slaves to journey out of slave addictions. Journey means walking in the wilderness was therapy for addictions. So as they walked, they grumbled and complained in their pain, but they also healed. Moses said God raised up zealous observers of his laws, especially through the responsibilities and the pains of giving oneness in marriage. So God helps people grow up when they confront the pains and responsibilities in their life, not when they try to get away from them in ecstasy. We go on to our next screen and we read, Yahwist and Elohim editors in the time of kings, and priest and Deuteronomist editors in exile, all used Moses' original insights to fill out Torah with warnings against sexual fantasy and the need for zealous observance of Yahweh's Sinai law to grow into a strong and healthy people. Finally, in gratitude to my financial supporters, I'd like to thank Peggy and Bill Tighe, my parents, Helen and Bill Birmingham, my cousin out in Illinois, Marie and Roland White, wonderful friends here in Manhattan. We go on to our next screen and we read Christine Whittam, a wonderful lady up in Maine, Peg and Tom Barrett, wonderful people who left me a little money over there in Union City, and Tina and Peter Sanvito from Weehawken, and Joe and Mary Jo Letty, wonderful friends of mine almost all my life. Finally, please go to fathertighe.com to see the overall outline of our journey of faith in the light of the cross. Finally, our theme, how do modern insights into Bible history help us better see God's core teachings at Sinai around 1180 BC? And second, did God wondrously inspire JEPD editors over 8 centuries to complete the original core of Torah around 400 BC? Thank you so much for joining us on this journey of faith in the light of the cross for Overview 16. Please continue to tune in.
Oh.